let's explore the challenges folks have approaching problem solving. Hey, I'm Justin Hitt with Inside Strategic Relations. This is kind of a sensitive topic because highly intelligent people very often are underperforming because of how they approach problem solving. You might be a high-income professional. You might be an entrepreneur. You might have certain subject matter expertise that has biased your ability to solve problems and actually causing you to make a solution more difficult than it needs to be, or otherwise problematic down the line. So perhaps you are your work outputs are poor due to environmental issues. You may have a resource issue that causes your work output to be poor, and that down the line makes you look bad. It causes other problems. You could find where you have external demands that kind of cause you to take these shortcuts that either sideline you from best practices or otherwise cause you challenges and frustrations when it comes to implementation. We're going to cover a simple 5-step plan. I'm going to cover it very quickly. Again, this is a podcast. If you have additional questions, you can visit us at www.insidestrategicrelations.com. But have you ever had the issue where that shortcut you had to take today really caused a lot of problems down the line? It blew up. It caused unforeseen risks and challenges. Maybe you have an off-the-cuff solution that's worked great in the past, but the application today is completely different, and now you're stuck in a situation where this fast decision, which was required by external constraints, has really not worked out. All this goes down to that most solutions that reveal the inadequacy of the individuals who have contributed to the solution are not going to be taken. So we need a systematic approach for addressing problems that takes into the fact that the individuals solving the problem have a high level of expertise and through that some cognitive biases that limit their ability to solve the problem. And it goes with the approach. Now let's talk first about a few ways that you could approach the problem in order to get to a solution faster without having the new risks created down the line or the unforeseen problems showing up later. And it starts with you could hire an expert to do it for you. See, you could pay once and achieve many different times. Are some problems that you want someone else to address. You simply want to transfer the risk and have someone else solve the problem, but you want to invest in intelligence. Now, I'm still going to give you 5 steps that you can use with these models that we're talking about right now, but it's important to understand that right now you don't have to solve the problem. You can find an expert, and if you have the criteria and the tools necessary to choose the right expert, they can solve the problem for you. You might also just accept the problem and live with it. You could live with the disappointment it brings or the frustration, or you could just say, hey, look, it's a problem I can't do anything about today. I'm going to set it aside and take care of it later. That's what a lot of people will do. You can also go with a package solution. So let's assume you understand the problem and the characteristics of the problem, and you could match a possible solution. So you want to write a document and you have an old version of WordPerfect and the package solution is Microsoft Office. See, that's a good fit, a good match. There's not a lot of thinking involved. And then there's you can also kind of do the Hail Mary. I see a lot of people do this where they have a problem and they go with this wild, audacious solution, and it's kind of like a Hail Mary that this is going to make it work. It's all going to be fine, and there's nothing to worry about. Well, of course, if any one of those common things people do worked, I wouldn't need 5 steps to give to you to help you assess and create solutions that both build your influence, but also transform business relationships and the profits. And I'll tell you one basis for this decision-making technique. And it's something that came up on my so I did an executive psychological evaluation, an executive physical. We talk about that in another podcast. And one of the things came up was the potential of me overestimating my level of intelligence. Now, that sounds like a pretty generic thing, but basically the psychologist who evaluated me, who, by the way, was a 20-something college student, said that I may over-exaggerate my ability to solve a problem or have the most ideal solution. Part of that is because of the ADHD, where I'm very enthusiastic and optimistic about solutions. And part of it is the Asperger's, which there's a lot going on in my brain. And sometimes when I put out a solution or a potential solution, it sounds fantastical. And a lot of people are concerned it may not work. But ultimately, I have a method, which I'm going to share with you, 5 steps, which I use to find solutions that have a high probability of success. Because I know by analytical evidence, by actually measuring situations, that many of the solutions that I share with customers, a vast majority of them, once implemented, create the desired results. Now, how is that possible? If there is a means or condition where you're overestimating your abilities and you're overestimating your knowledge level. If you ask a room of 100 people, where would you rate your level of intelligence? Average, above average, or below average? The majority of people, 60 to 80%, will say that they have above average intelligence. So we're just going to assume that everybody, because by the way, did you see the trick? The majority of the people cannot answer above average intelligence because average intelligence would be average. The trick here is that I assume that I know nothing. I assume when approaching a problem that I know absolutely nothing, that I'm a complete novice. Now, with the sleep deprivation, it's improving. In the past, I actually didn't know anything because my recall was very poor. And my recall was based on very structured, basically binders that I was keeping lessons learned and things. I'd have to go look up the things. But basically, I assume I don't know anything. In fact, I will challenge my own beliefs so that we can get into step number 1. The most important thing about solving a problem is defining the outcome desired. Now, you might think it was, maybe a problem statement. You might think the first thing you should do is define the problem and the impact the problem's have. No. By defining the outcome, you can do triage to the approach. Now, this is very important. We're going to give you 5 steps. These 5 steps apply to any problem-solving situation, and it addresses many cognitive biases that are in the world of a high-income professional. A lot of people think that's why they pay me the big bucks. I know all the answers. Well, you might not know the answers. Subject matter experts, they're an expert. They ought to know the answer, but then they don't because this situation has variables they haven't seen before. Or the professional or business owner who's got all these external constraints and doesn't quite know what's the right path because while there's a variety of solutions, not every solution has the resources to implement. So starting with a clearly defined outcome, what is the desired situation? You'll see that on all my surveys. I want to know what it is that you want to create. What is the outcome that is most desirable? Then we're going to come back and brainstorm, number 2, the minimum viable solutions. Now, we're not committing to anything. We're just saying, look, if I want $1 million, what's the characteristics of that outcome? Do I want $1 million now? Do I want $1 million in 5 years? Do I want $1 million in 10 years? If you want better advancement at work, what would that look like? Would you be advanced to a manager? What's the title? What's that outcome? Now we're going to think about, well, if this is the outcome that I want, what is the minimum viable that I'll accept? So we're scaling that outcome to what is success criteria. Number 3 is we're going to assess the risks and the obstacles to getting to that outcome. Now, a lot of people will back up and say, my minimum viable, I'd like to have $1 million at retirement, but my minimum viable is just maybe $100,000. Well, if that's unqualified, going towards the minimum target is actually going to make you worse off. You want to look at the risks and obstacles getting to the most desired outcome. And this is important because if you do a SWOT analysis or you do a SIPOC, these are models for assessing a situation, you'll develop a gap analysis around what is the most likely outcome that you can achieve in the near term and the most likely outcome you can achieve in the long term. And in fact, if your outcome is clearly defined, your minimum viable will be somewhere between where you are now and where you want to be. And now this assessment of risks and obstacles clearly defines the path. From this point, now you go to number 4, which is to plan a specific minimum viable product. That means we're acknowledging that the outcomes could be overly inflated. Now, in my situation, it's a psychological defect where my brain is really looking at the huge picture, and it's building systems and it's building interconnections. And I have to assume that, we won't be able to build a warp drive to get to Mars. And we won't be able to build a warp drive to get out of our solar system in my lifetime necessarily. But dreaming about it, there's got to be something in the between from where I am today to where I want to be that is quite possible. And I went through this exercise with my son, and we discovered there are scientists looking at the theory of warp drives. There are scientists looking at the possibility of producing oxygen in atmospheres on Mars itself. So by establishing your risks and obstacles in the perspective of that fantastical outcome that you most desire, keeping in mind there might be several steps and stages along the way, you can now sit down and develop a plan for what is most likely to be able to be achieved. Now, in my case right now, I don't have a huge desire in space exploration. My kid does, but investing in SpaceX or investing in a project that potentially is going to Mars, investing in his education so he can learn about those topics that he's interested in, is probably going to be the step between where I am today and the possibility of flying around in a TARDIS or flying around in an Enterprise ship. Can you see how this works? A lot of times, highly intelligent people will think about the major desired outcome, and I'm exaggerating a little bit to make it interesting, but smart people will think about that big outcome, the ideal best way of doing something, and they will get overwhelmed. They'll say, well, we don't have the tools, we don't have the automation. I'm saying capture that information, set it aside, and then develop a plan for what you can do. What can you do to move you towards your goals or objectives right now with the resources you have, keeping in mind this further outcome? That's motivation. But more importantly, challenging your assumptions about your ability to even reach that point. Number 5 is now you're going to start building out a phased activity plan. So let's say you desire $1 million and you've got a job that makes $100,000 a year. And to reach that $1 million, you have a definition that it's going to be $1 million in cash. And actually, if you have a job of $100,000 a year, you need about $2.3 million in your retirement at retirement age in order to produce that $100,000 a year. But let's say you just got to go to get to 2.3 million. You got to get through $1 million first, and maybe you haven't developed it, and the million's your target. So, to go from 100,000, if your gross income could be set aside. Now we're talking about risks and obstacles. If your gross income could be set aside, in 10 years, you could have $1 million in cash. Now we know that the obstacle is our living expenses, which will very often take away most of all of our gross income, as well as taxes and these other aspects. So a $100,000 salary may only net $20,000 or $30,000 a year. Now we have, through the SWOT analysis, we might talk about our strengths. Well, our strengths is if we can net $20,000 a year, we can invest that at a certain percentage. So you can go do the math over there. If we are able to reduce our costs, we're able to increase more available to invest. If we're able to increase multiple streams of income, for example, maybe we invest in a house that is a rental while we live in an apartment, which is an expense. And the rental generates enough income to pay off the property. And now we're utilizing the income of other individuals to build the wealth and assets necessary for the $1 million in cash. We might do a SIPOC, which is, what is it that we want? What are the inputs? What's the process? What's the outputs? And we build this out, but we decide the one thing we could do today to move towards the $1 million is to save more money. Now, I know I covered a lot here, but all this of the 5 steps doesn't really matter if you don't, number 5, take action. And that would be simply structuring your finances. You can use our bucket system. You can use a couple different methods we've talked about in the past, but ultimately making sure that at the end of the day, you've saved more money than you've spent. Or at the end of the day, you have a net return. And we've now taken this very large obstacle and we've turned it into a daily measure. Now, here's the thing. That daily approach, that phased plan gives you opportunities. This is project management. gives you opportunities to measure your progress along the way so that you can then repeat this whole process and refine your desired outcome, which ultimately, if you've reached the outcome, you've solved the problem. See, this approach to problem solving isn't about the problem. It's about what we want to achieve. Because maybe that problem is just like the obstacles. It's, non-consequential. It doesn't really matter. And ultimately, we are moving towards the outcomes that are desired using available resources, which could be relationships. It could be the funds that you have. If you buy a house to rent, the relationship is with your tenant, and your tenant is basically paying down the note on the investment property, as well as generating equity in the property. And then overall, you are gaining an asset that not only cash flows, but in the future could be cashed out to cover that ultimate goal. Now, this will create many different threads. And that's why I always recommend a written plan. As you go through these 5 steps, now we can help you go through these 5 steps if you're growing a business, or you're doing a big investment project, or you've got some plan and you'd like some coaching. You visit us at www.insidestrategicrelations.com, and if there's a slot available, you can be a part of coaching. But we will simply walk through these 5 steps, creating artifacts and evidence to support your outcomes. If you came to me making $100,000 a year and you said, I'd like to have $1 million when I retire, and we do the math on that, we would realize that $1 million is not a reasonable outcome. And in fact, that you need $2.3 million, we can now make an adjustment in the plan starting with step 1. If we start talking about number 2, minimum viable products, and you're talking about, getting a different job, or you're getting, and that different job is only going to increase your income by 10 to 20%, and that may not still be enough to reach that adjusted goal. So we would have to look at other options and other opportunities. Number 3 is once we've kind of have an idea, kind of a cafeteria of possible viable solutions, we are going to start assessing each. You might peter out during the middle of that because you didn't really want that outcome a whole lot. And you might decide just to live with the problem that you've got, or you might have to take a different approach because the risks or the obstacles are not something that you want to address. But then again, we may go through a gap analysis or a SWOT analysis or a SIPOC, and you realize that a big chunk of what you want to achieve can happen and will happen following some kind of plan. So what we then do, number 4, is develop the deliverables, which is your minimum viable product, your minimum viable approach, and we just get a test in place. If you wait too long when addressing a problem, the problem's going to stay around. But finally, the approach, the phases, what is it you can do today? What is the daily action that you can take? How are you going to keep track of it? It becomes a way to shape your life so that you achieve the outcomes, the influence, and the control that you desire in your life. It's not about having a high income. It's not about having influence in your marketplace. It's about achieving the outcomes that you desire. Now, we can talk about the reason why you want that outcome, and we do talk about that when we do step number 1. But if we stop at step number 1, it's just fantasy. If we stop at step number 1, it is overestimating your outcomes. And I'll go real quick to the catalyst that had this individual thinking that I overestimate my desires. I'm raising $5.3 million to do a community project. Now, that's over a 5 to 10 year period, and that's a big span. I want to narrow that down, but we don't have to narrow that down because, again, I'm using these 5 steps. And over that $5.3 million project, someone who's just hearing that for the first time, whose frame of reference is a college student, and they're making $10,000 or $20,000 a year, they're relying on scholarships or their parents, that sounds like a lot of money. But in my world, every day I'm working with 30 million, 50 million, 100 million. Some of my clients have $1 billion. Some of my clients have hundreds of millions of dollars. $5.3 million for a community development project really is not that much money. And ultimately, my short-term objective is to improve my own property first. In fact, my home, my own property, is a demonstration site, a tiny microcosm of the larger project I want to implement. And while I'm implementing the local small project, I'm able to build partnerships, joint ventures, build mailing lists, identify potential partners, identify additional revenue streams, grant programs, and means of raising the $5.3 million. Now, will I raise the $5.3 million in 5 years? Well, my plan is to raise it in 5 years. However, along the way, because I'm using these 5 steps that we can go over in coaching for your unique situation, I'm using these 5 steps, I have greater clarity, I have small wins and achievements, I have the momentum necessary so that those around me will have confidence in my ability to create, so that when I say, hey, we're raising 5.3 million and today we're starting with 100,000, they're not going to freak out because they understand there's a plan in place. I can see what's going on. I can see what he's advocating and what he's implemented. You can do the same thing. You can do it within your career. You can do it within your community. And you can do it within your both financial and career-oriented world. It starts with asking your questions. I can be reached at www.insidestrategicrelations.com. That's where you're going to start asking your questions. It starts also by being able to approach problem solving in a way that removes the cognitive biases, that puts you in a humble position where you're able to work with others in a cooperative way. And finally, it positions you to transform business relationships into profits. Now, I can guarantee that kind of results. I'm Justin Hitt with Inside Strategic Relations. I can guarantee that you can transform business relationships into profits because first, we're looking at the outcomes that you desire. And as you achieve these outcomes or these steps towards that outcome, you'll gain the confidence to use a system like what we just talked about today in approaching problems, and you'll be able to use it in a consistent way. Now, you might piss off all the people around you because you'll be achieving and they won't be achieving. You might also make people confused and a little upset because you have this consistent track record that looks like luck. But I will tell you, it's not luck. It's daily micro actions that all move towards a clearly defined outcome. And it's the willingness to be flexible between where you are today and where you want to be. It's not worrying about the resources that you have or don't have. It's about aligning resources to drive the outcomes that you desire. This can be very complex, so I welcome you to do a paid consultation. I welcome you to join one of our weekly Q&A groups, but it is just 5 simple steps, starting with clearly defining your outcome, then discovering that minimum viable. What is that outcome that you're acceptable, that's acceptable in the short term that will help get you there? Assessing your risks and your obstacles, then moving towards a clear, measurable plan for a specific minimum viable product. Finally, number 5 is to approach in phases with activity. Folks, if you got a problem, this will solve it. If you need help implementing this formula, that's where a coaching program comes in. But either way, I'm Justin Hitt with Inside Strategic Relations, saying yes, you can create and keep profitable customers and transform every business relationship into profits guaranteed. Today, we've been talking about an approach to solve problems. I'm looking forward to hearing about your successes. Thanks for listening.